Welcome back to Seek Before Sleep. Somewhere in a museum basement, sitting in a climate control drawer, there is a small rectangle of baked clay. It fits in the palm of your hand. It's covered in tiny pressed marks, wedge-shaped lines pushed into wet mud by someone who lived before any civilization you were ever taught about in school, before the pyramids, before the Greek philosophers, before the Roman Empire was even a distant idea. And here's the thing that should stop you in your tracks. We can't fully read it. Not because nobody has tried, not because the technology doesn't exist, but because whatever system of thought, whatever world, whatever way of organizing reality produced that tablet, it is so far removed from everything that came after it that our best scholars, armed with the most powerful computational tools ever built, are still standing at the edge of it, squinting into the dark. That's what this is about. The oldest writing on Earth, and the uncomfortable truth that a significant portion of it remains untranslated, undeciphered, or deeply contested. Some of it may never be fully read, not in our lifetimes, maybe not ever. Now, before we go any further, there's something important to say about how we'll be ever going to handle this, because this is a subject that attracts a lot of noise. There are people who will tell you the oldest tablets describe ancient astronauts, or lost civilizations, or gods who came from another planet and engineered the human race. That framing is everywhere online, and it sounds exciting, and it is designed to sound exciting, but it's not what the evidence shows. What the tablets actually say, when we can read them, is genuinely fascinating enough on its own. We don't need to dress it up. So throughout this, we're going to be careful to separate what the tablets literally contain from what various people, ancient, medieval, and modern, have claimed they contain. Where something is genuinely uncertain, we'll say so. Where something is speculation, we'll call it speculation. Where something is well established, we'll stand on that ground confidently. The real story is strange enough, because the oldest writing does feel in a very specific and documentable way, like it points to a world before us. Not before humans, but before the version of human civilization we recognize. Before literacy was widespread, before writing was used for literature, or religion, or law, before it was used to tell stories at all, in the way we think of stories. The earliest tablets are not poetry, they are not myths, they are not prayers, they are, for the most part, administrative records, lists of grain, counts of animals, marks that say essentially, this many jars of oil went to this place. And yet surrounding those mundane records, woven into the deeper layers of the archive, there are things that resist translation entirely. Scripts that have been studied for over a century and still haven't yielded their structure. Languages behind languages, systems of symbols that may represent sounds, or may represent concepts, or may represent something in between that we don't have a clean category for anymore. That is what we're walking toward tonight. If you're listening to this to unwind or fall asleep, that is genuinely why I make these. So if that's you, follow along. Let the strangeness of ancient clay carry you somewhere quiet. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I look at those comments, and it's always something that gets me. Someone in Melbourne just getting their morning coffee. Someone in London drifting off at midnight. Someone in Sao Paulo in the middle of the afternoon. All of us somehow listening to the same piece of ancient mystery at completely different moments of the same shared day is one of the stranger and better things about making this kind of content. Tell me your city and your time. I genuinely read them. Also, if you want to listen without ads and without background music, I put the full audio version on Spotify, clean and quiet. The link is in the description. It's the version I'd listen to myself, honestly. So, the oldest writing on Earth. We're going to start before the tablets themselves. Back when the idea of writing was just barely becoming an idea. We're going to move through the clay archives of Uruk, one of the first true cities, and then to a specific tablet found near the ancient site of Kish, that some researchers argue is the oldest written document yet discovered, though that claim, like most claims in this field, is more complicated than it first appears. We're going to look at who could actually read these early texts and what it cost to learn. We're going to look at what happens when pictures, slowly over centuries, stop looking like what they represent. And then we're going to spend serious time with the scripts that still haven't given up their secrets. Proto-Elamite, the Indus script. Linear A real scripts studied by real scholars that remain genuinely undeciphered. Not for lack of effort, not for lack of intelligence, but because the distance between us and real scripts, whoever pressed those marks into wet clay, is in some deep way almost incomprehensible. Almost. Let's see how close we can get. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. When most people think about the invention of writing, they picture someone sitting down and deciding to record language. A kind of ancient breakthrough moment. A person with a reed and a surface and an intention to preserve words for the future. That picture is almost entirely wrong. Writing didn't start as a way to capture language. It started as a way to track things. And the gap between those two purposes is enormous, and it matters enormously for understanding what we're actually looking at when we look at the oldest marks human hands ever made. First, though, we need to be careful about a line that archaeologists and linguists argue about constantly. The line between writing and what researchers call proto-writing, because not every system of marks is writing in the full technical sense, and the distinction isn't pedantic. It changes what we think we know. Full writing in the strict definition is a system that can encode language. It captures the sounds or the words or the grammatical structures of what a speaker would actually say. You can read it aloud, and it sounds like speech. Modern English text works this way. So does cuneiform eventually. So does the hieroglyphic system of Egypt. But proto-writing is something different. It conveys information through symbols without necessarily encoding language directly. It communicates quantities, categories, identities, instructions, but it doesn't follow the grammar of any spoken tongue. You can extract meaning from it, but you can't necessarily read it out loud as a sentence. It points at the world, rather than transcribing what someone would say about the world. And the reason this distinction matters so much is that the earliest marks we have from Mesopotamia sit exactly on this uncertain border. Some researchers classify them as writing, others call them proto-writing. Some argue the line itself is too rigid. The writing didn't flip on like a switch, but evolved gradually from one mode into another, over centuries with no clean moment where it crossed over. That argument has a lot of weight behind it, and it's worth keeping in mind as we move through the evidence, because some of what gets called the oldest writing in the world is depending on how strict your definition is not quite writing yet. So what do we actually have, and where does it come from? The story goes back further than the tablets themselves. It goes back to a technology that archaeologists spent decades undervaluing because it looked so ordinary. Small clay objects, shaped by hand into simple geometric forms, spheres, cones, cylinders, discs, some of them marked with incised lines. These are called tokens, and they have been found across an enormous swath of the ancient Near East from Turkey, down through Syria and Iran, in layers dating back to at least 7,500 BCE. That's over 9,000 years ago, long before the first cities, long before agriculture had fully consolidated. People were already using small clay objects to represent things. The leading interpretation, developed most thoroughly by archaeologist Denis Smant-Besserat over decades of research, is that these tokens were an accounting technology. Each token represented a specific commodity or quantity. A small sphere might mean 1 unit of grain. A cone might represent a jar of oil. A cylinder might stand in for an animal. When a transaction happened, when goods moved from one party to another, tokens were used to keep track of what was owed or delivered. It was a physical, tactile system of record-keeping. Not language, not story, just quantities of things made manipulable and portable in clay. For thousands of years, that system was apparently sufficient. Small-scale communities, relatively simple exchanges, manageable by moving tokens around on a surface or keeping them in a pouch. But then, something changed. Around the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, in the region of southern Mesopotamia, settlements began to scale up in ways that had no precedent. The city of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, grew into something genuinely new. By the late 4th millennium BCE, around 3,400 to 3,100 BCE, Uruk may have had a population of somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people. That is not a village, that is not a chiefdom, that is a city with all the complexity cities create. And complexity creates problems for simple token systems. When you are tracking hundreds of transactions across a large institutional economy, when you have temples and storage facilities and labor pools and agricultural outputs all moving through a centralized administration, you need something more stable than loose clay objects in a bag. You need records that can't be disputed, can't be accidentally scrambled, can't be lost when someone tips over a table. The solution that emerged was elegant in a way that feels almost inevitable in hindsight. Administrators began sealing tokens inside hollow clay envelopes called boule. The tokens went in, the envelope was sealed shut, and then here is the important step. Marks were pressed into the outside of the envelope to indicate what was inside, so you didn't have to break the seal to know what the record contained. The outside surface of the clay captured the information, and once you have that, once you have a flat surface covered in marks that stand for quantities and commodities, you are very close to not needing the tokens at all, which is apparently what happened. At some point, administrators realized they could just make the marks on a flat clay tablet and leave out the tokens entirely. The three-dimensional physical record collapsed into a two-dimensional symbolic one. The marks on the outside of the bulle became in effect the first tablets. What those marks recorded in the earliest phase was narrow by almost any measure. They tracked commodities: grain, barley, wheat, livestock, sheep, cattle, goats, finished goods, beer, bread, textiles, oil. They tracked quantities, and they tracked movement. This amount coming in, this amount going out, this amount held in storage. They tracked labor, how many workers were assigned to which tasks, how many rations they were due. They tracked land, which fields had been allocated, which were under cultivation, what yields were expected. This was the institutional economy of an early city written in clay. The temple complexes of Uruk were not just religious centers. They functioned as redistributive economic hubs, taking in agricultural surplus, managing large workforces, distributing rations and goods. Writing in its earliest form was the administrative tool that made this scale of organization possible, or perhaps more precisely, writing and urban administration co-evolved each enabling the other to grow larger and more complex than either could have managed alone. That context shifts how we read the early tablets when we look at them. They're not mysterious in the way that people often assume ancient documents must be. They are not encrypted wisdom or hidden theology. They are, in the most literal sense, receipts, inventories, labor rosters. They record the logistics of feeding large numbers of people and keeping a complex institution running across seasons and years. What makes them extraordinary is not what they say, but that they exist at all. That someone facing the problem of memory at scale reached for wet clay and a reed stylus, and pressed into it the solution that would eventually become everything we think of when we think of the written word. Now, there's a version of this story that implies a single clean invention. One moment, one place, one people. That version is tempting, but probably wrong. The evidence suggests that the conditions that produced writing in Uruk were not unique to Uruk. Similar accounting technologies appear in roughly contemporary layers at other sites across the ancient Near East. Proto-Elamite writing, which we'll spend serious time with later in this story, emerged in what is now southwestern Iran at approximately the same time as the earliest Uruk tablets, around 3100 BCE, possibly even slightly earlier. Whether these systems share a common ancestor, whether one inspired the other through contact, or whether complex accounting just tends to produce similar solutions when similar institutional pressures are applied, that question is still genuinely open. What we can say with confidence is that the late 4th millennium BCE in Mesopotamia and the surrounding region was the period when the practice of recording information in permanent marks on a flat surface became something real and lasting. Before 3400 BCE or so, there are tokens, there are tally marks, there are symbols pressed into pottery. After 3100 BCE, there are tablets, hundreds of them, from Uruk alone, and scattered among those tablets a smaller number of objects that push the threshold even earlier, or that challenge our clean categories for what writing even is. One of those objects was found near the ancient site of Kish, and it may, depending on who you ask and which arguments you find more convincing, be the oldest written document ever discovered. To see what this looks like on the ground, we have to walk into one specific place and time, southern Mesopotamia, around 3400 to 3000 BCE. The city of Uruk, known today as Waka in Iraq. In the middle of that city, a dense cluster of monumental buildings that archaeologists call the Inner Precinct. Thick mud brick walls, courtyards, storage rooms, platforms, altars, columned halls. This is not a quiet temple in the modern sense. It is a combination of religious center, administrative headquarters, and economic engine. This is where most of the world's earliest tablets come from. When excavations began there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, teams were not looking for paperwork. They were interested in big, impressive architecture, carved stones, statues, anything with obvious display value. But as they dug through the later layers, around levels 4 and 3 in the archaeological stratigraphy, they kept finding small flat objects of fired clay, often broken, often clustered together in what looked like ancient waste deposits. It turned out they had uncovered an archive, not a library of literature, an archive of administration. If you could hold one of these proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk IV in your hand, the first thing you'd notice is how unbook-like it is. They're often palm-sized rectangles or squares, sometimes with a slight lens shape where the clay was pinched and smoothed between someone's fingers. The surface is divided by lightly ruled into columns, sometimes into rows, straight lines drawn with an edge or a string, turning a patch of mud into something like a spreadsheet. Within those ruled spaces, the signs themselves are still pictures, or at least they started that way. You see a crude drawing of a head, a jar, a fish, a sheath of grain, an animal's body in profile. Many are stylized beyond easy recognition, but if you compare them to later Sumerian pictographic lists, the connections become clearer. This shape stands for barley. That cluster of wedges stands for sheep, another for ration, another for worker, another for a particular kind of garment. Alongside the pictorial signs, and often taking up most of the tablet, are number systems, plural. The later scribes did not have one universal set of numerals. They used several overlapping metrological systems, each tailored to different categories of things. One way of writing numbers for counting discrete animals, another for volumes of grain, another for capacities of beer jars, or lengths of cloth, or surface areas of fields. This is part of what makes the early tablets look so alien. A single mark that looks like a small circle or a series of strokes can mean wildly different quantities depending on context. On one tablet, it might mean 10 sheep. On another, the same looking mark in a different numerical system might mean 30 liters of barley. The scribes knew the code. We're still reconstructing it, numerical system by numerical system, like trying to learn several measurement languages at once. Despite the complexity, patterns emerge quickly when you read enough of these pieces of clay. The content repeats over and over in slightly different formats. Grain rations issued to groups of workers, list of people, sometimes identified by names, sometimes by titles or roles, and the amount of barley or beer they are assigned. Inventories of livestock belonging to the temple, so many sheep, so many goats, so many cattle. Records of textiles produced by specific workshops, numbers of cloaks, tunics, specialized garments perhaps for particular ceremonies or for export. You see tablets where each column is a category of goods, each row a person or a workshop. Column 1, name or job. Column 2, number of days worked. Column 3, amount of grain due as payment. Column 4, beer rations. Column 5, notes about status, female workers, children, dependent laborers. There are tablets that appear to track deliveries of fish or reeds or timber to construction, projects in the Yena precinct itself. All of this is astonishingly prosaic. It is also, in its own way, intimate. The oldest writing we have does not begin with kings boasting or priests speculating about the gods. It begins with anonymous clerks recording that so-and-so received 2 selah of barley and 1 jar of beer on this day, that such-and-such workshop delivered 12 finished garments, that a herd contained 53 sheep at the last count. And yet, even when we can identify the broad category, a ration list and inventory, a tally of workshop output, the details frequently resist us. Part of the difficulty is physical. The script is not standardized yet. A single sign can appear in dozens of variants, rotated, stretched, simplified, embellished, mashed together with neighboring signs. Scribes in different rooms or different generations seem to have had their own preferences and local conventions. On top of that, the system is dense with abbreviations. A sign, borrowed from one context, might be used as a shorthand for an entire phrase in another. A mark that originally depicted a jar might in a labor text stand for ration or for a standard unit of pay or for issued from storehouse, all without any explicit explanation. Over time, repeated combinations of signs became bundled into compact ligatures. To the people who learned this system as an apprenticeship craft, those compressions saved time. To us, they hide meaning. There is also a layer of bureaucratic jargon that was probably opaque even to many people living in Uruk at the time. Technical terms for grades of grain, for cloth qualities, for job categories inside the temple organization, esoteric labels for ranked personnel, specialized occupations, perhaps nicknames for particular work gangs or administrative units. Some of those terms evolved into well-known Sumerian words in later centuries, where we can catch them and pin them down. Others disappear entirely after the proto-cuneiform phase, leaving us with signs that we can draw and catalogue, but not confidently pronounce or translate. So we stand in an odd position. We can look across thousands of tablets from the precinct and say with good evidence that they are about grain, beer, textiles, livestock, personnel lists, workshop outputs. We can often read the numbers. We can sometimes read the commodity labels. We can occasionally pick out personal names, especially when they survive into later periods. But the connective tissue, the bureaucratic turns of phrase, the internal shorthand of a large late Uruk institution, that world of nuance, is only partially accessible. From a distance, the archive is clear. This was a machine for managing an urban economy. Up close, at the level of individual signs and phrases, the writing feels like something from another planet. Familiar objects, grain, beer, sheep, wrapped in a symbolic system that is neither quite language nor quite pure numbers. A script halfway between pictures and words, already specialized, already professionalized, already operating inside a hierarchy that has left almost nothing of itself behind except these difficult, beautiful receipts baked hard in the fires of 4,300 years. And sitting just beyond these carefully ruled tablets, in roughly the same centuries, is another object from another site that complicates the story of firsts even further, a small stone plaque from near Kish, whose status as the earliest writing is still being argued over today. The plaque from Kish is one of those objects that looks simple until you start asking it hard questions. It was found not in Uruk, but hundreds of kilometers to the northwest, near the ancient city of Kish, in central Mesopotamia, in a grave. It's small, made of stone, carved rather than written in soft clay. On one face, you see a human figure, probably a ruler, standing with a bow or staff. Around and above that figure, a handful of tiny incised marks that are not pictures in any obvious pictures. To some eyes, they look like early cuneiform, to others, like decorative scratches. That disagreement has never fully gone away. The reason people care so much is timing. The layer the plaque came from is often dated to around 3,200 to 3,000 BCE, roughly the same horizon as the late Uruk tablets, maybe even slightly earlier, depending on how you reconstruct the sequence at Kish. If those little marks really are writing, if they are signs standing for words or syllables rather than just symbols of status, then the Kish plaque might represent an independent, or at least parallel, birth of script in northern Mesopotamia. But if does a lot of work here. Archaeologists don't date writing by intuition. They rely on a set of tools that are powerful, but not perfect. The first is stratigraphy, where the object sits in the layered cake of soil and ruins. If the plaque is sealed beneath a floor that can be securely dated by radiocarbon samples, pottery styles, or other artifacts found in that same layer, then you can argue that it must be older than that floor. If it cuts through earlier deposits, you have to adjust. Every trench is a three-dimensional puzzle of cuts, fills, walls, burials, pits, and later disturbances. In the case of Kish, the early excavations were done in an era when field methods were less rigorous than today. Notes can be incomplete. Some contexts were disturbed by later building, looting, or erosion, so even the stratigraphic position of the plaque has been debated. Was it really sealed in an undisturbed early level, or did it slip down from above, get reworked into the grave from a later layer? The second dating tool is association. What else was found with it? Pottery is especially useful because ceramic styles change quickly and have been carefully charted across the region. If the grave goods around the Kish plaque match a pottery assemblage that in dozens of other well-dated sites belongs around 3000 BCE, that gives you a strong relative date. If the associated artifacts are mixed, some older, some younger, the picture gets muddy fast. The third tool is paleography, the study of scripts themselves as they change shape over time. Later cuneiform signs have known life histories. We can see how a particular wedge pattern in 2600 BCE evolved from a pictographic ancestor in 3200 BCE. The direction of that change is rarely symmetrical. Early signs tend to be more pictorial, more curved with more strokes. Later signs are compressed, angular, optimized for speed on clay, with a reed stylus. When paleographers look at the Kish plaque, they try to fit its marks into that evolutionary tree. Do they resemble late versions of signs we already know from Uruk, which would suggest a later date, or do they look like plausible ancestors, forms that could logically have simplified into the standard form repertory? Different specialists reach different conclusions. Some argue that at least one of the marks could correspond to a known sign for king or a personal name element. Others see no stable match at all and warn against forcing resemblance into data it doesn't belong in. This is where the phrase, "the oldest writing," starts to crack, because Uruk is not the only place where early administrative marks show up. While the Iana precinct gives us thousands of proto-cuneiform tablets from around 3400 to 3100 BCE, there are contemporary or slightly later finds at Jemdet Nasser, at Shurupak, at Teluka, at Susa across the border in what is now Iran. Some of these sites use scripts clearly descended from the Uruk system. Others, like the proto-Elamite tablets at Susa, follow their own path with sign shapes and number door systems that are only partly related, if at all. At the same time, in Egypt, labels and tags with early hieroglyphs appear on grave goods in Abydos and Nakada, perhaps as early as 3300 to 3200 BCE. In southeastern Europe, even older incised signs appear on pottery from places like Vincha and Tartaria, though most specialists think of those as proto-symbolic rather than fully linguistic writing. First starts to look like a tangle of overlapping experiments spread across different river valleys, each solving similar problems: recording ownership, tracking offerings, marking authority, using different local symbol sets. So when popular media points to one object, the Kish plaque, the Nama palette, a single Uruk tablet, and says, "This is the first writing," that's a simplification. What we actually see is a century or two in which multiple communities in Mesopotamia and beyond are pushing clay, bone, stone, and ink toward more stable, conventionalized sign systems. Some of those experiments became long-lived scripts, others dead-ended, leaving behind a handful of enigmatic pieces. And under all of this is another quieter problem. We haven't actually studied everything that's already been dug up. Early excavations across Mesopotamia recovered tens of thousands of tablets and inscribed objects. The most famous are photographed and pored over, but many more early pieces, especially small fragments or tablets with very few signs, sit in museum storerooms in Baghdad, London, Berlin, Istanbul, Philadelphia, and dozens of smaller collections. Some remain entirely unpublished, known only from old field inventories. Others are published in black and white line drawings from a century ago, without modern photographs or 3D scans. A broken tablet with 3 faint signs might have been catalogued as an illegible fragment in 1910 and never revisited. Today, with better imaging, that same piece might prove to be part of a very early level or carry an unusual sign variant that tightens the dating of a whole sequence. We don't know how many such early objects there are exactly. Estimates vary, but it is safe to say that thousands of proto-cuneiform and early cuneiform fragments have not yet been analyzed in detail with modern tools. Security issues, funding constraints, the sheer labor of reading and publishing clay, these all slow the process. Some material is inaccessible because of war or political instability. In those cases, even knowing what's there relies on decades-old excavation reports. This is the grounded mystery at the heart of the first writing story. The answer may already exist, in part in dusty drawers and crowded shelves, in fragments that have not been matched, in contexts that haven't been re-evaluated with current methods. The Kish plaque might represent a local scribal tradition that never took off. It might be a descendant of Uruk, writing misdated by early diggers. Or it might sit on the blurry line between decorated object and text, reflecting a moment when people were still experimenting with what marks on the surface could do, until the scattered pieces are brought into clearer focus. The first will remain plural, a cloud of possibilities, more than a single point, and inside that cloud, another question waits. Even if we can place these early signs in time and space, who exactly was able to read them? Whoever they were not many. By the time we can see them clearly, in the slightly later city-states of southern Mesopotamia, they call the place where they learn their craft the Eduba, the tablet house. It's not a school in the modern sense, with a broad curriculum and rotating teachers. It's a workshop of memory, a place where a handful of children, almost always boys, from families with something to administer, are taken aside and drilled day after day into the strange new habit of turning speech and number into marks on clay. Their training does not begin with literature. It begins with lists. An apprentice sits with a lump of damp clay and a copied model tablet. The first exercises are simple. Rows of vertical wedges, then horizontal ones, then diagonals, over and over, until the hand learns the feel of the stylus, and the eye learns what counts as a correct sign. Then come the basic numerals, the counting systems for grain, for animals, for jars of oil, each with its own numeric series. Then comes sign repertoires, standardized lists of professions, place names, kinds of livestock, cereals, fish, textiles, metals, containers. We actually have some of these school texts. A little tablet filled with the names of trees in no particular story, just item after item. Another that lists personal names. Another that moves through a progression. Simple signs on one side, more complex compounds on the other. In some, you can see the teacher's neat, compact script on one line and the student's clumsy imitation beneath it. Wedges pressed too deep or at the wrong angle. This is what it meant to learn to read and write in the first cities, not absorbing a language that you already spoke, but memorizing a code that condensed a whole economic and social system into a finite set of marks. A competent scribe had to hold hundreds of signs in memory, know which number system to use for which commodity, understand the order in which information was supposed to appear on a tablet, date, place, who gave what to whom, under whose authority. The tools of the trade were simple, but they mattered. The basic instrument was a stylus, usually a cut reed, its tip trimmed to make a triangular cross-section, pressed into soft clay at different angles and depths. It produced the characteristic wedge impressions that give cuneiform its modern name. Earlier, more pictorial stages of writing sometimes used pointed or rounded tools to draw lines and curves. But as the system standardized, speed and repeatability won. Press, rotate, lift thousands of times. Not all styli were the same. Some were thicker for larger accounting tablets, viewed at a distance in a storeroom. Others were fine and sharp for personal letters or scholarly compositions. There are hints in later periods that scribes were proud of their particular hand, just as calligraphers can be recognized by their strokes. Clay itself was a technology. It had to be clean, kneaded free of pebbles and organic debris. For everyday notes, a handful of local mud might suffice. For archival tablets, scribes seem to have preferred well-levigated clays that would dry evenly and hold impressions crisply. Surface moisture had to be just right. Too wet, and the wedges would blur. Too dry, and the stylus would gouge instead of shape. Once inscribed, a tablet could be left in the sun to harden, or kept damp if it was only needed briefly. Some were fired accidentally when buildings burned. Others were deliberately baked, especially legal contracts or important accounts, to make them more durable. Alongside the tablets, we find bulli and seals, hollow clay balls that once enclosed tokens or documents, and cylindrical or stamp seals, rolled across wet surfaces to leave identifying images and inscription bands. Seals are another piece of the literacy puzzle. To roll a seal across a tablet and link your name or your emblem to the contents, you did not necessarily have to read every sign, but you did have to trust that the scribe had captured the agreement correctly. In the earliest periods, the ability to make the marks and the authority to validate them with a seal sit very close together in the same small circle of people. What did those people actually do? In the proto-cuneiform phase, scribes are first and foremost administrators and accountants. The earliest tablets from Uruk, Jemdet Nasser, and related sites are dominated by entries for barley rations, labor gangs, deliveries of wool, distributions of fish, tallies of livestock, records of fields and their yields. Every line is someone's workday, someone's grain measure, someone's obligation to a temple, a household, or a palace. To keep such a system running, you don't just need rulers and priests. You need a class of humans who can translate the movement of goods and people into stable records, and then reverse the process at will, turning abstract marks back into enforceable reality. If a worker complains that he hasn't received his allotted barley, someone goes to the tablet room and checks the entries. If a warehouse keeper is suspected of skimming oil, someone audits the tallies. As centuries pass, the roll broadens. The same skills that let you count cattle also let you copy hymns, legal codes, omen collections, and later mathematical tables, and lexical lists that are no longer about immediate economic needs. Many scribes are attached to temples, where they merge accounting with ritual duties. Others serve in royal courts, drafting letters, treaties, and propaganda inscriptions. Reading and writing become not only practical tools, but marks of status, pathways into priesthood and scholarship. But for a very long time, literacy remains a narrow channel. Estimates for later Mesopotamian cities suggest that only a few % of the population could read and write cuneiform fluently, and in the earliest periods, it was almost certainly much less. The Ejuba is not open enrollment. It is where the sons of officials, priests, estate managers, and perhaps a few particularly promising dependents are shaped into the human interface between spoken life and written record. This small trained class effectively decides what counts as worth fixing in clay. They choose which transactions get recorded and which pass unmarked. They decide the format of contracts and the conventional phrasing of royal claims. They compile the sign lists that define what proper writing looks like. When new signs are invented or old ones fall out of use, it is through their hands that the changes spread or don't. This is where the mystery of early literacy sharpens. The first texts are not a transparent window into the whole society that produced them. They're a carefully framed view, filtered through the needs and habits of the people who had both the skill and the institutional backing to make marks that would endure. When we read a Uruk ration tablet or puzzle over a short proto-writing inscription from Kish, we are hearing not a chorus of voices, but the measured speech of a few specialists speaking for institutions that fed and employed them. Whole domains of experience, domestic life, personal stories, unrecorded beliefs run alongside the tablet tradition without ever entering it. So when we ask what the oldest writing on earth has to tell us about a world before us, we also have to ask whose world exactly made it onto the clay, and who standing in the tablet house with a reed decided where the line between silence and inscription would fall. If you go back far enough in the tablet sequence, the marks don't look like wedges at all. On the very earliest pieces from Uruk, around 3300 to 3200 BCE, you can still see the ghost of drawing. A sheep is not yet an abstract sign. It's a little outline with 4 legs and a hint of a head. A jar looks like a jar. A fish is a fish. The scribe takes a pointed tool and incises lines into the clay, scratching curves and loops the way someone might doodle in wet sand. It's tempting to imagine this as a gentle pictorial phase, where people were almost sketching their accounts, but try to picture the reality of an Uruk administration during its boom period. Fields under cultivation on a scale never seen before. Flocks numbering in the thousands. Workers streaming in and out of storehouses, taking rations in pre-measured amounts. Each transfer, each allotment, supposed to be captured on clay. Now, imagine being the person with the job of cutting all those tiny sheep legs and fish tails and jars, one by one, into damp tablets, day after day. As the clay starts to dry under your hand, the writing system changes because the work changes. Drawing pictographs with a sharp tip is slow. It also demands a high degree of fine motor control, and it wears grooves into the surface that are more likely to crumble or blur when the tablet dries. As the volume of writing grows, and as more people have to learn it in the tablet house, the system begins to favor whatever is faster, more regular, and easier on the material. The reed stylus, pressed rather than dragged, solves several problems at once. Instead of pulling a line, the scribe now presses the cut tip into the clay. One quick motion produces a triangular wedge broad at the base, tapering to a point. Turn the stylus and press again, and you get a wedge at a different angle. Combine 2 or 3, and you can still evoke the old picture, but in a much more economical way. Over a few centuries between the later and early dynastic periods, this preference hardens into a convention. Curving incisions give way to combinations of straight wedge-based strokes. You can see it clearly if you compare early and later versions of the same sign, the rounded cow's head that once clearly showed horns, and muzzle collapses into a set of angular impressions. The jar becomes a rectangle, partially filled with wedges. The fish loses its outline and survives as a characteristic cluster of strokes. At the same time, the whole script rotates. In the very oldest tablets, signs are usually written in columns, top to bottom, and the direction of the strokes reflects that orientation. By around 3000 to 2800 BCE, the standard has shifted to horizontal lines going left to right, and the signs themselves have been turned 90 degrees to match. What used to be the top of the sign becomes its side. To us, this looks like a radical change, almost a different script. To a scribe living through it, it's probably just a series of incremental adjustments, a slightly different way to hold the tablet, a more comfortable posture for the wrist, a format that makes it easier to scan lines quickly in a crowded archive. Clay has its own logic, and that logic pushes writing toward wedges. Soft clay doesn't like long, thin grooves. They close up as the surface relaxes, or as the tablet flexes while being handled. Wedge impressions, by contrast, compress the clay rather than cutting it, pushing material aside and leaving a durable three-dimensional shape. They catch the light better, making lines of text legible even in dim indoor spaces. They can be executed fast in a practiced rhythm. Press, lift, rotate, press again. Standardization rides on top of these physical constraints. In the tablet house, teachers want their students to produce signs that are recognizable at a glance, no matter who wrote them. Pictorial variety becomes a liability. Two different scribes might draw a sheep very differently, but a sequence of 3 wedges at fixed angles is much harder to misread. Sign lists begin to codify not just which signs exist, but what a correct version looks like. As the shapes settle, something else happens. The old pictures loosen from the things they depict. Initially, a sign is closely tied to one reference. The sheep picture means an actual sheep or a unit of sheep. The barley sign means barley, but administrators are constantly pushing the system into new domains, abstract categories, verbs, names, grammatical particles. You can't keep inventing new pictographs for all of these. Instead, scribes start reusing existing signs in more flexible ways. The sign that once meant barley, for example, can be borrowed to write the word for ration, because barley is the standard ration. Then it can also be borrowed for the syllable that sounds like that word, regardless of what is being talked about. A picture that began as a thing becomes a sound. The sign acquires what linguists call a phonetic value. This is where polyvalence enters the story. Polyvalence means that one sign can have multiple possible readings. It can stand for a whole word, a logogram, for a syllable or group of sounds, a phonogram, or function as a classifier that hints at the general category of the word that follows a determinative. Which one is intended depends on context. The other signs around it, the type of text, the habits of the particular scribal tradition. From the perspective of someone learning to write, this is powerful. A finite set of igns, each with a bundle of values, can be combined to spell out thousands of words. You no longer have to invent a new mark every time you need a new concept. From the perspective of someone trying to decipher those texts 5,000 years later, it's a nightmare. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian scribes lived inside this polyvalent system. They inherited long lexical lists that told them for each sign its different uses and core pronunciations. They copied bilingual word lists that match Sumerian logograms with Akkadian sound values. They could look at a tricky sign in an old Sumerian hymn and know from their schooling that here it should be read as a word, there as a syllable, somewhere else as a silent classifier. We do not have all of those aids. Modern scholars reconstruct them from whatever survives. Scattered school tablets, signless baked by chance in city fires, late commentaries. For many common signs, the system is reasonably well understood. For rarer signs, or for early transitional tablets, where the pictographic heritage is still strong and the phonetic system not yet fully developed, the ground is less firm. A single sign on a proto-cuneiform tablet from Uruk might be the picture of an object, a protologue for that object, an early attempt to write a sound, or a bookkeeping convention we simply haven't recognized. Sometimes the same cluster of wedges appears in a context that obviously involves grain. Elsewhere, the same shape shows up in a string of personal names. Is it being read as barley, as ration, as the sound of part of a name, or all three at once? Ancient scribes could in principle trace these layers back. Their training bound them to a living chain of practice that stretched across centuries. They read archival texts that were already old in their own day, and they glossed archaic words in the margins of their exercises. To them, the earliest wedges were not alien marks from a lost world. They were just the old, slightly awkward handwriting of their institutional ancestors. We stand much further away. When we say we can read cuneiform, what we usually mean is that we can handle the mature system fairly well. The standardized script of the later 3rd and 2nd millennia, the period when sign shapes, values, and grammar are comparatively stable. As we move backward, toward the moment when pictures are turning into wedges and sound is being layered onto symbol, the certainty thins. The script is still in motion, and there is no single fixed code to break. The shift from pictures to form doesn't just change what the tablets look like. It sets the limits of how far back our understanding can reliably go. At the point where the clay still remembers being a drawing surface, and the signs have not yet settled into their later multi-layered identities, we're often reading through dark glass, guessing at which values the hand that held the stylus intended. And it's right there, in that twilight zone, between image and wedge, between thing and sound, that the very oldest tablets sit, waiting for us to decide which of their marks we dare to turn back into words. If you set aside the undeciphered systems for a moment and look at the earliest tablets, we actually can read with some confidence. A pattern appears almost immediately. They are not myths. They are not cosmic histories. They are paperwork. Take one of the classic types from late Uruk and Jemdet Nasser levels, the ration list. A typical tablet will be divided into neat compartments by incised lines. In each box, you see a sequence of number signs, a commodity sign, and then very often a personal designation of some kind. 10 measures of barley for the worker, marked with the female sign. 3 measures for a man associated with the sign for smith. Half rations for dependent. Full rations for overseers. Sometimes the commodity changes. Barley in one column, beer in another, oil in a third. The format tells its own story. These are not private notes. They are official allotments, probably handed out from temple or palace storehouses to groups of laborers working on irrigation ditches, fields, or construction projects. Writing in its first secure appearance is a tool of administration. Another very common early genre is the delivery note. These are small, single-purpose tablets that record the movement of goods from one place to another. So many jars of beer received from this brewer, so many sheep transferred to that herdsman. Often, the verb is not written out. It is implied by the layout. A heading with the commodity, a total, a list of sub-entries. The physical tablet itself may have traveled with the goods functioning as a receipt. Some still preserve the whole, where a cord passed through tying tablet and bundle together. Then there are field allotments yield. On these the main sign you see is not grain, but land. Plots are measured out in units of surface area with numerical notations attached, followed by the names or titles of those responsible. A temple estate is divided into smaller holdings. Individual gardeners, tenant farmers, or dependent of a household are assigned strips of irrigated ground. In later periods, we can sometimes correlate these texts with actual landscapes, but in the earliest, we mostly see the skeleton of the system: number, field, person. Inventories round out the picture. Whole rooms are reduced to sequences of entries: tools, containers, textiles, livestock, 10 copper sickles, 4 axes, 3 adzes, 20 wool garments, 5 linen garments. The tablets don't pause to describe them in any qualitative detail. They care about kind and count, what exists, in what quantity, under whose responsibility. Underneath all of these genres runs a surprisingly sophisticated treatment of number. The scribes of Uruk are not simply scratching tally marks. They're switching between different counting systems depending on what they are counting. Grain and flour are measured in capacity units based on standardized volumes of a container. Animals are counted in whole heads with a different repertoire of number signs. Land is calculated in a sexagesimal-derived system of area measures. Even certain manufactured items can trigger specialized numerical series to modernize. It looks as though several incompatible numeral systems are being used side by side. To the people doing the writing, each system keyed into a particular way of thinking about the thing as volume, as area, as discrete units. Some tablets are essentially tables of equivalence, conversion sheets that tell you implicitly how many of one sign worth of barley equals another sign's unit of bread, or how a given field measure relates to its yield. These were probably training tools in scribal education, but they also expose the mental infrastructure behind early accounting. All of this matters for a deceptively simple reason. There are no stories in this corpus, or at least if there are, we have not recognized them yet. The earlier secure narrative texts in Sumerian appear centuries later, in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, when royal inscriptions and hymns begin to emerge fully formed. By that point, the script is mature, the language is stabilized, and the scribal tradition has had generations to develop literary conventions. In the Uruk and early dynastic administrative tablets, by contrast, there is no obvious narrative voice, no sequence of events unfolding in time, no explicit characters acting in a plot. Even when a ruler's name appears, it is usually as the responsible party for a transfer or as the owner of a field, not as the protagonist of a story. That absence is telling. It suggests that at least for a significant stretch at the beginning, writing was not invented to preserve myths that already existed orally. It was invented to solve immediate logistical problems of scale, tracking labor, grain, animals, tools. Only later did it expand sideways into law codes, royal boasts, hymns, laments, and epics. This does not mean people in Uruk lacked stories. Oral traditions almost certainly flourished long before clay tablets. Tales of origins, local gods, floods, and heroes would have been told and retold around hearths and in courtyards. They simply didn't leave marks in the surviving record until the script and the institutions behind it had both matured. What we have instead, baked in clay, is the pulse of a civilization seen through its ledgers. We can reconstruct the flow of barley from field to granary to worker. We can see herds growing and shrinking with seasons, tools being issued and returned, land being parceled and reparceled. We can infer hierarchies of status from ration sizes, detect specialized professions from commodity types, glimpse the outlines of temples and estates through the way their resources attract. But the people themselves mostly remain shadows. Thousands of tablets list individuals only by a single name, a job title, or even just a sign that distinguishes male from female, adult from child. We rarely see family relationships. We almost never see anyone speak. No one in this earliest archive introduces themselves or tells us what they believe. Their existence is captured as entries in systems they did not design. There is a quiet strangeness in that. The oldest coherent writing on Earth does not tell us who these people thought they were. It tells us what they owed, what they were given, what they managed, and what they moved. It preserves the architecture of their economy in painstaking detail, but leaves their inner lives almost entirely unstated. We meet them not as voices, but as numbers attached to signs. When people hear that we can read cuneiform, it sounds complete, almost finished, as if some scholar in the 19th century cracked the code, shut the book, and now the ancient world lies open in translation. The reality is quieter and stranger. There are several different ways for writing to be untranslated, and they pile on top of each other. At the most basic level, some signs are simply unread. Early Uruk tablets, proto-cuneiform lists, odd local variants. We can match many signs to later Sumerian or Akkadian values, but not all. Some wedges, some clusters, appear a handful of times and never again. Others show up only in a narrow context that does not clearly announce what they mean. We can guess based on parallels and later usage, but a guess is not a reading. Then there is the problem of language. Even when the sign shapes are familiar, the language behind them may not be. The earliest tablets in southern Mesopotamia are usually assumed to be writing some stage of Sumerian, but that is an inference, not a proof. The script is still heavily lographic. Phonetic clues are sparse. Grammatical markers are often missing or ambiguous. In some regions and periods, we are not even certain which language a corpus belongs to. Early texts from Susiana, for instance, hover between Sumerian influence and local traditions that will later become Elamite. You can have signs you know, but a language you do not fully recognize. A third layer is context. Imagine finding a modern spreadsheet with only column headings and numbers, no instructions, no labels for the file, no knowledge of the institution that produced it. You could decipher every character, understand every word, and still not really know what the document is doing. A great many early tablets are like that. We can see that a sign is barley, that another is a personal name, that a group of wedges represents a capacity measure. But what is the institutional setting? A temple, a private estate, a palace office? Is this a permanent rotation of rations, a one-off emergency distribution, a set of fines, a festival budget? The text may be technically readable, but without the missing social and economic context, it remains only half understood. And then there is simple damage. Clay is durable, but it is not immortal. Tablets were broken in antiquity, reused as fill-in later buildings, crushed in fires and collapses, eroded by salt and moisture. Many survive only as palm-sized fragments, preserving a corner of a larger text. A few signs at the beginning of a line or the tail end of a column, divorced from everything that once surrounded them. On others, the wedges are there, but the edges have crumbled. A tiny change in angle can turn one sign into another. In early periods, when scribes are still experimenting with how to press the stylus, different signs can look nearly identical, especially after 4,000 or 5,000 years of wear. A single uncertain stroke can flip a reading from field to city, from sheep to goat, from a personal name to a title. Every broken edge, every smoothed wedge, turns a potential sentence into a puzzle. All of this would be difficult enough if we had only a few dozen documents, but we do not. The scale is overwhelming. Since systematic excavation began in Mesopotamia, archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of thousands of clay tablets and tablet fragments. Estimates vary, but it is likely that well over 500,000 cuneiform objects exist in museum, collections and storerooms worldwide. Many sit in crates or drawers still unpublished. Some have only a catalogue number and a rough description. In older collections acquired in the 19th or early 20th centuries, the recorded find spots can be vague or completely missing. Even within published corpora, large portions are available only in hand copies or early photographs, not in high-resolution images that might let us revisit doubtful signs. And for many, there is no translation at all, just a transliteration of the signs into Latin letters, waiting for someone to take the time to interpret them. The backlog is immense. Each tablet requires patient work, identifying signs, reconstructing broken lines, comparing formulas with parallel texts, checking personal names against post-topographic lists, weighing alternative translations of key words. Multiply that by tens of thousands of near-identical ration lists, loans, contracts, court records. Scholars understandably focus on texts that promise something new, a royal inscription, a literary composition, a rare letter. Routine administration, the very backbone of the archive, often falls to the bottom of the queue, and yet it is often in that routine material that the oldest habits of writing hide. Complicating things further are the limits of the methods we rely on for decipherment. When a script is new to us, we look for bilingual texts where the same content appears in two systems, like the famous trilingual Behont inscription that helped crack Old Persian cuneiform, form and through it the older Mesopotamian scripts for proto-Elamite, for the earliest Meso-proto-cuneiform, for the Indus signs. No such Rosetta Stone equivalent has been found. There is no long inscription that says in effect, "This is what I am saying," twice in two different ways. We also lean heavily on long texts and repeated formulas, standardized royal titles, recurring legal clauses, repetitive phrases in hymns and laments. All of these provide scaffolding. Once you know that a certain bundle of signs probably means King of Kish, you can recognize it elsewhere and build outward. Early administrative tablets are often short, formulaic in a way that does not help. A heading, a few lines of entries, a total, no narrative, no explicit verb, sometimes not even a date formula naming a ruler or event. Many undeciphered corpora are also short in an even more stubborn sense. The Indus inscriptions, for example, are famously tiny, often just 4 or 5 signs on a seal, without longer strings of text, without repeating patterns that clearly mark grammar or syntax. There is very little for comparative methods to grab onto. Proto-Elamite tablets are longer, but the system is idiosyncratic, and the apparent absence of later, clearly related writing means we cannot work backwards from a known language stage as we can with Sumerian or Akkadian. In other words, for several of the oldest writing systems on Earth, we lack almost every advantage that made the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs and later cuneiform possible. No bilingual, few long continuous texts, limited context, many damaged objects, enormous backlogs. What we have instead is a slow accumulation of tiny gains, a sign whose meaning becomes a little more likely because of a new parallel, a cluster of tablets that begin to clarify an office title, a better photograph that reveals an extra wedge across the whole corpus. Thousands of clay voices remain at the edge of hearing, not entirely silent, but not yet clear. They sit in shelves and cabinets, in regional museums and national collections, waiting for methods to improve, for new comparisons to be drawn, for someone to devote years to what looks at first glance like just another list. And even where the system itself has been largely cracked, there is still room for surprise. Whole genres, whole ways of thinking that may be sitting in plain sight, technically readable, but not yet truly understood. To see that more clearly, it helps to look at one of the most stubborn cases of all, a script that has been known for more than a century, copied, catalogued, digitized, and still refuses to yield more than fragments of meaning. Proto-Elamite sits just to the east of the better-known Mesopotamian story. While cities like Uruk and Ur were rising in southern Iraq, another urban world was taking shape on the Iranian plateau. At Susa, in today's southwestern Iran, and at a scattering of highland sites stretching toward Fars and beyond, people were building platform temples, storing grain in huge jars, managing herds and labor forces that needed to be counted, rationed, and controlled. Sometime around 3300 to 3100 BCE, in this setting, a new way of making marks on clay appeared. We call it proto-Elamite. Most of the tablets come from Susa, from levels that correspond roughly to the very end of the Uruk expansion, and the centuries just after. A few hundred more have turned up at sites deeper in the plateau. Tisork near Kashan, Talimalian in Fars, smaller settlements scattered across what would later be Elamite territory. The dates are imprecise, but the peak of proto-Elamite use seems to fall between about 3100 and 2900 BCE, with some scholars stretching that window into the early 3rd millennium. Then it stops. No long, smooth lineage, no clear evolution into later Elamite writing, just a burst of tablets, then silence. What those tablets are doing, at least on the surface, looks familiar. They are overwhelmingly administrative. List of commodities, tallies of labor, accounts of animals, allocations of grain or oil or beer. Many are dominated by numbers, columns of wedges that represent capacities, weights, head counts. They use multiple numerical systems, just as late Uruk protoform does different bases for counting animals versus jars versus days. You can watch scribes switching between them, using one set of signs for discrete objects, another for volumes of liquid, a third for measures of grain. Certain sign clusters recur often enough and in stable enough positions that they almost certainly refer to institutional roles or standard goods. A particular combination at the start of a line, followed by numbers, then commodity signs, looks very much like an office title. Other clusters show up before animal signs in a way that suggest herd subtypes, age classes, or perhaps geographic designations. At Susa, groups of tablets can sometimes be sorted by these recurring headings, hinting at departments or households within a wider administrative apparatus. On this level, proto-Elamite is not opaque. We can see that it is accounting. We can tell when something is being counted, when something is being measured, when totals are being given. Comparative work with Uruk and Gemdet Nasser tablets has tied a number of proto-Elamite, numerical and metrological signs to specific quantities. In some cases we can say with reasonable confidence, this is a jar of grain, this is a sheep, this line records a transfer, that line a receipt. But the crucial layer under all this remains stubbornly out of reach. We do not know what language or languages lie behind proto-Elamite. It is tempting to assume that it writes an early form of Elamite, the language attested much later in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE at Susa and Annan. Tempting, but not secure. The time gap is more than 1,000 years. The script itself seems to vanish and then reappear in a modified form only centuries later, if at all, and the structure of the text gives us very little grammar to work with. Almost no obvious particles, no clear endings that could be compared with later elephology. We also do not have stable phonetic values for most signs. In proto-cuneiform, a number of signs can eventually be tied to Sumerian words. You can watch a pictograph of a head, for instance, turn into a syllabic sign that writes the Sumerian word for head, and by extension, related sounds. That bridge between picture, word, and sound gives you leverage. In proto-Elamite, the bridges are shaky. Some signs probably began as pictures, but they had already become quite stylized by the time we find them. Their later descendants, if there are any, are debated. Without a known language to match them to, almost every phonetic assignment risks becoming circular. This uncertainty leads to a deeper question. Is proto-Elamite even trying to record spoken language in the same way later scripts do? It clearly encodes quantities and categories. It probably encodes personal names and titles. Repeated sign sequences in name slots are hard to interpret any other way. But whether the system has a full set of syllabic or phonetic signs capable of writing open-ended speech is not yet demonstrated. Some specialists think it may be a number-heavy notation system, strongly logographic and limited in its ability to capture grammar. Others argue that phoneticism is there, just faint, buried in conventions we have not yet learned to see. Over the past few decades, this small disagreement has been surrounded by an enormous amount of careful work. Proto-Elamite tablets began to be systematically copied and published in the 20th century. But the real acceleration came with digital tools, high-resolution photography, 3D scanning, and more recently, reflectance transformation, imaging, have made it possible to revisit old tablets and check every wedge angle. Projects at the Louvre in Thran and at a number of universities have created online sign lists and databases. Each sign given an index number, each tablet broken down line by line, occurrence by occurrence. This has produced detailed maps of the system's internal structure. We can see which signs cluster together and which almost never do. We can distinguish regional dialects of the script with slightly different sign repertoires in Susa versus the highland sites. We can track changes over time within the Susa corpus itself as certain signs fall out of use and others become more common. Algorithms borrowed from computational linguistics have been applied to the patterns, testing whether the distribution of sign types looks more like language or more like a constrained code. The answers are suggestive, but not decisive. Some features resemble written language. Sign frequencies follow curves reminiscent of known scripts, and there are positions within the line where name-like sequences tend to appear. Other features look more like a specialized notation, long stretches dominated by numbers and commodity signs with very few elements that could, plausibly, be grammatical particles. The system seems to straddle a boundary, more abstract than a pure tally system, not yet transparently a phonetic script. What makes proto-Elamite especially frustrating is that we also lack external anchors. No bilingual inscription has turned up, no proto-Elamite tablet with a parallel in early form, no later Elamite royal text that clearly reuses the old signs. There is no Behiston for this script, no Rosetta Stone equivalent, and the corpus, though substantial, is still modest. A few thousand tablets, many fragmentary, most extremely repetitive. There are patterns, but not enough variation to pin those patterns to definitive meanings. As a result, even the best supported readings tend to be probabilistic. A certain sign cluster almost certainly marks an official. This numerical sequence probably expresses a capacity measure close to so many liters that column heading is very likely a term for a herd or a work group. Scholars publish these proposals cautiously, often with caveats and alternative possibilities laid out beside them. The overall picture of a late 4th millennium bureaucracy managing food, labor, and livestock on the Iranian plateau feels increasingly clear. The precise words that bureaucracy used to talk about itself do not. There is no conspiracy in this, no hidden translation kept from public view, just a set of hard limits, a script that died young, leaving no long historical inscriptions, no hymns or myths or royal boasts to cross-check, a language family that may or may not be related to the later Elamite. We can partially read a body of texts dominated by lists and numbers whose very efficiency deprives us of the redundancy that helps crack codes. So proto-Elamite remains what it has been for more than a century, tantalizingly half-known. We can watch its scribes at work, see their columns of numbers rise and fall, trace the flow of sheep and grain and beer through institutions we can name only in neutral labels: Office A, Household B, Department C. But the voices behind those accounts, the sounds they made, the words they spoke, stay just beyond hearing. To feel how wide that gap can be, even when the tablets are sitting in museum drawers and the script has been studied line by line, we can turn to another undeciphered system. This one is older in some ways, more widely discussed, and even more silent. Not for lack of effort, but because its texts are short in a way that defeats almost every tool we have. Far to the east of Susa, another urban experiment was unfolding along the Indus and its 10 tributaries from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE. A civilization we now call Harappan or Indus built something that still feels slightly unreal: gridded cities with baked brick houses aligned to cardinal directions, sophisticated drainage and sewer systems that would not be matched in many places for thousands of years, standardized weights and measures used over an area stretching from the coast of Gujarat to Kut, the plains of Punjab, and into what is now eastern Afghanistan, and threaded through this world on tiny objects you could close your hand around signs. Most of them appear on seals, small squares of carved stearite, usually around 2 to 3 centimeters across. On one side, a short line of symbols. Above or beside them, a stylized animal, a unicorn with a single curved horn, a humped bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a tiger. Sometimes there is a ritual object, a feeding trough, a brazier, something like a standard. The carving is precise. The iconography is remarkably consistent from site to site. The seals were not just art pieces. When pressed into clay, they left impressions used to seal bundles, jars, doors, perhaps letters, on perishable materials. Dozens of such sealings have turned up, bearing the same combinations of signs and animals. Other inscriptions appear on tiny copper tablets, on pottery, on stone weights, on tools and jewelry. The script travels with the merchandise, with the administration, with the rituals of everyday life. But every time we hope it will say more, it stops. The overwhelming majority of Indus inscriptions are painfully short. 5 signs, 6 signs, sometimes 10. A few stretch to 20 or more, but those are rare. There are no long narrative tablets, no monumental walls covered in carving, nothing like the king lists and legal codes of Mesopotamia or the royal inscriptions of Egypt. The texts are like names on doorbells, labels on jars, tokens of identity and authority. They give us patterns, but almost no continuous speech. This brevity is the core of the problem. With proto-Elamite, we're constrained by the nature of the documents, repetitive, numerical, heavily administrative. With the Indus script, we're constrained by sheer length. Short sequences mean fewer contexts. Fewer contexts mean fewer opportunities to watch a sign change its role, to see it behaving sometimes like a word, sometimes like a sound, sometimes like a grammatical ending. Without those shifts, it is difficult to tell how much of the system is phonetic and how much is purely logographic or symbolic. Still, there are hints of structure. Sign frequencies follow distributions broadly similar to those of known writing systems. Certain symbols tend to appear at the beginning of lines, others at the end, suggesting something like name plus title, or title plus numbered item. Some signs recur across the entire Indus realm with remarkably stable shapes, while others are rare or apparently local, which is what you might expect from a standardized script with regional variants. Computational studies have argued that the arrangement of signs is not random, not merely decorative, but governed by positional rules consistent with language-like syntax. Yet even that conclusion is debated. One camp of researchers treats the induced signs as a true script, probably capable of recording at least a substantial portion of a spoken language. Within this view, the disagreements focus on which language family that might belong to. Dravidian is a leading candidate. Languages like Tam, Telugu, and Brahui have deep roots in South Asia, and some see echoes of Dravidian morphology in the patterning of signs. Others have proposed early Indo-Aryan Munda, or a lost language family, with no surviving descendants. Each proposal can align a handful of signs and hypothetical words. None has produced a broadly accepted decipherment. Another camp doubts that the system ever reached the point of full writing. On this reading, the signs are a complex system of logos, clan marks, and numerical notations used to indicate ownership, status, or ritual affiliation, but not to represent sentences in a fully phonetic way. The extreme brevity of the texts, their heavy use on seals rather than on long documents, and the apparent lack of evolution into later South Asian scripts are cited as supporting evidence. Critics of this view counter that we may simply be missing the perishable media, wood, palm leaf, cloth, on which longer texts were written. What almost everyone agrees on is how little we can safely pronounce. We can say that the Indus script was standardized across a vast area and in use for centuries. We can say that it was tied to an urban network with high levels of craft specialization, trade, and social organization. We can map which signs travel together with which animals, which types of objects, which layers of particular sites. But when we try to read these sequences aloud, to give them stable sounds and meanings, the ground drops away. There is no bilingual inscription linking Indus signs to another known script, no later tradition clearly preserving Harappan myths or royal names we can back-project. When the urban phase of the Indus civilization wanes after about 1900 BCE, the script vanishes with it. Later writing in the subcontinent, the Brahmian Kosti scripts of the mid-first millennium BCE, shows no straightforward descent. The result is a peculiar kind of silence. We stand inside the ghost of a civilization that laid out cities with mathematical care, monitored weights to fine tolerances, and moved goods over thousands of kilometers. And we hold in our hands its official seals. We can feel the wear on their edges, see the polish of repeated handling, trace the carved lines of its signs. We know they mattered, we just do not know what most of them say, or even whether they were ever meant to capture language in the way we expect writing to do. If proto-Elamite frustrates us with half-read ledgers, the end script taunts us with something smaller and stranger. A few hundred distinct symbols arranged in thousands of tiny disciplined bursts, just long enough to prove there is a system, never long enough to let it speak. Move the map west across Iran, past Mesopotamia, over the Aegean. By around 1900 to 1800 BCE, on the island of Crete, another experiment in administration and storage was taking shape. We call it Minoan, after the legendary King Minos, but that name is a modern label. The people who built the great complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and Kato-Zakros did not leave us a clear name for themselves. They did, however, leave writing. From roughly 1800 to 1450 BCE, Crete's palace centers kept archives of clay tablets, nodules, and ceilings. Storerooms filled with pithoi, giant storage jars lined the wings of these buildings. Corridors branched into magazines, stacked with grain, oil, wool, and perfumed unguents. Somewhere in these complexes, scribes sat with damp clay and styluses, recording what went in, what came out, and who was responsible. Their script is called Linear A. The signs are angular, simplified, written in rows. They're not pictorial in the way the earlier Sumerian tablets were. Whatever pictures they once resembled have been smoothed into abstract strokes. Linear A appears on tablets, on small round L's, on 3- and 4-sided clay bars, and on nodules attached to containers and doors by strings. It is an administrative script tied directly to the palace economy that organized agriculture, textile production, and trade, and we can read almost none of it. The irony is that its neighbor and probable descendant has given up its secrets. Around 1450 BCE, on Crete, and later on mainland Greece, another script appears in similar contexts. Linear B. For decades, both Linear A and Linear B were undeciphered. The tablets looked related. The signs seemed similar, but no one knew what language either of them recorded. In 1952, that changed. An architect and amateur codebreaker named Michael Ventris, building on work by Alice Cobra and others, showed that linear B codes an early form of Greek. He reached that conclusion by doing exactly what we wish we could do for every unknown script: counting, comparing, and looking for patterns over large numbers of tablets. Linear B tablets are usually longer and more repetitive than the Linear A ones we have. They come from palace archives at Pios, Nos, Myene, Thebes, and elsewhere. They deal with sheep, wool, chariots, landholdings, personnel lists. Certain words appear over and over in similar positions. Some tablets repeat the same clusters of signs with only one element changed, like an item in a list. Ventris and Kober analyzed these regularities, proposed phonetic values for the signs, and tested whether the resulting words could match plausible names of places and gods known from later Greek. They did. Once a few place names clicked: Knossos, Amnisus, Pios, the rest followed. Linear B moved in a matter of years from mysterious marks to malleable, if limited, bureaucratic Greek. Linear A sits right beside this success story and refuses to cooperate. Because the two scripts are clearly related, scholars have tried the obvious move. Borrow the phonetic values of Linear B signs, apply them to Linear A, and see what happens. This gives us something like a sound system. We can transcribe many Linear A words into strings of syllables, Asasa, Rao, Turusa, and so on. We can identify sign sequences that behave like numbers, fractions, commodities, personal names, and place names. We can see accounts lined up in columns, totals at the end, headings at the top. In other words, we can often say how the documents are structured. We can sometimes say roughly what kind of thing is being counted. But when we try to match the sounded-out words to any known language, they do not land cleanly. If Linear A used exactly the same sound values as Linear B, and if the underlying language was simply an earlier dialect of Greek, we would expect to recognize at least a few core words or deities. That does not happen. The resulting transcriptions do not look like Greek or any other securely attested Bronze Age language of the region. Most specialists therefore think that Linear A writes a different language entirely, which has come to be called, cautiously, Minoan. It is probably a pre-Greek language of the Aegean, one that did not survive in later written form. It may not belong to any known family. If it has descendants, they left no unambiguous linguistic trail. This is what makes Linear A so strange. It is not that we are staring at wholly opaque symbols the way we are with the Indus script. On the contrary, we know a fair bit about the signs. We can catalogue them, list their frequencies, identify their positions in the texts. We have partial phonetic values for many of them, thanks to their overlap with Linear B. We have a decent idea which marks indicate numbers which stand for commodities like grain, wine, or oil, which likely represent units of land or livestock. We can even watch the script functioning inside a palace economy. A typical linear tablet from Hagatria or Bistos might list a series of entries, a personal or place name, a sign that seems to indicate a commodity, a number, at the end, a total. Some tablets divide amounts into fractions that appear to be standardized across different sites. Clay nodules with seal impressions show that officials were closing storage rooms and containers under some form of control procedure. The whole system looks like an early version of double-entry bookkeeping tailored to Bronze Age agriculture and craft production. Yet when we ask the simplest questions, what is the word for sheep here? Is that a title, a profession, or a family name? Which god is being invoked on this offering table inscription? The answers blur. A few words seem to recur in religious contexts. Asa, Saridamat, other sequences that appear on libation tables and ritual vessels. Some researchers have suggested links to known deities from later Greek tradition or from Anatolia, but such proposals are tenuous and most remain speculative. Without a bilingual inscription, without a longer text that clearly narrates something we can cross-check against archaeology or later myth, each guess sits on uncertain ground. The result is that Linear A occupies a narrow, frustrating middle ground between the fully undeciphered and the comfortably readable. It is not mute in the way the Indus signs are. It tells us enough to reconstruct an economy that weighed grain, allocated rations, tracked flocks, managed storage, and probably coordinated overseas trade with the Cyclades in the Near East. It shows us a writing tradition that lasted centuries and spread across multiple create, but it stops just short of telling us what that economy called itself, what terms it used for rank and office, how it named its gods, how it described its own island. We can see the palace accountants at work. We can list their signs, follow their totals, and trace the movement of goods across stores and seasons. We just cannot yet hear the language behind their numbers, the spoken words that once accompanied the wet clay and the stylus strokes. In a script descended from it, used a few generations later by different rulers on the same island, we can finally understand phrases like, so many sheep, such and such a man, holder of this plot of land. Linear B lets us listen in on the Mycenaean takeover of the same administrative machinery. Linear A shows us that the machinery was there first, humming away in another tongue, one that for now remains just beyond our reach. Shift the map back east. Long before Linear, long before the Minoan palaces, scribes in southern Mesopotamia were using cuneiform for something new. Not sheep, not jars of oil, not labor rosters, a list of kings. We call it the Sumerian king list. Dozens of copies survive, written over many centuries from different cities and different political situations. They do not all agree in detail, but they share the same basic structure, a sequence of lines, each with a city, a ruler's name, and a length of reign. Sometimes a father's name, sometimes a brief note. Kingship descended from heaven. Then the flood swept over. Kingship was taken to. On the surface, it looks like a bare-bones chronology, one dynasty after another, lining up the past in a straight line. But the king list is not a modern history book. It is political theology, written in clay in a landscape of rival cities, each claiming its own gods, its own traditions, its own elders who remembered things differently. A text like this does a particular job. It says, kingship itself is a divine institution. It comes from heaven, not from human councils or chance. It moves on purpose from city to city. When Uruk rules, it is because the cosmic office of king has chosen to sit there. When Kish or a scene rules, that is not a random shift. It is part of a plan. Copying this list, updating it, inserting your own dynasty at the right point in the sequence, was a way of saying, we are not upstarts. Our power is legitimate. We stand in the same line as heroes and semi-divine rulers from the deep past. And then there are the numbers. In the earliest part of the king list, the so-called antediluvian section, the reign lengths are not just long, they are absurd, at least in biological terms. 8 kings before the flood, ruling in 5 cities with reigns that add up to more than 200,000 years. Individual kings are said to have ruled for 28,800 years, 36,000 years. One gets 43,200. Early translators struggled with this. Were they reading the numerals correctly? Mesopotamian scribes used a sexesimal or base 60 system. Units could be grouped in 60s, 600s, 3,600s. Some scholars try to correct the figures, to scale them down into human lifespans, but the pattern shows up too consistently across different copies to be a simple error, and the same text later on assigns much more realistic numbers, reigns of 24, 36, 40 years to historical kings. We can cross-check with independent inscriptions, so the extreme values seem deliberate. Today, most specialists think of these pre-flood figures as symbolic, schematic, and ideological rather than literal. Long reigns, expressed in neat sexesimal units, may be encoding ideas about cosmic order, cycles of time, or the special status of an age before the present one. They mark those early kings as qualitatively different from later rulers, closer to the gods, less bound by ordinary time. We can see similar moves in other traditions. The Hebrew Bible gives the antediluvian patriarchs lifespans of hundreds of years. Later Jewish, Mesopotamian, and Iranian texts speak of world ages, each ruled by different powers, separated by catastrophes. The Sumerian king list stands inside that family of ideas, but it is the oldest such sequence we can read directly in the script of the people who used it. What makes it especially eerie is that the pre-flood section is anchored in named places that archaeologists know: Eridu, Badira, Lak, Sippar, Shuripak. These are not mythical realms. They are real cities, whose mounds have yielded temples, pottery, and mundane administrative tablets. Likewise, many of the post-flood kings in the list are people we can meet in other texts. Enma-Baragi of Kish, for example, shows up on an independent inscription as a historical ruler. Later dynasties at Urin and Lhasa can be aligned imperfectly but recognizably with archaeological strata and year-name lists. So the king list is not pure myth. It is not pure archive either. It is myth history, a telescoped narrative that welds legendary figures, local traditions, and real dynasties into one unbroken line, and running right through the middle of it is a single stark sentence: "Then the flood swept over." That line cuts the clay like a scar. Everything before it belongs to a qualitatively different era, one of impossible reigns and semi-divine rulers. Everything after it is the world we can, at least in part, check against bricks, graves, and economic tablets. The flood is the reset, the hinge of time. For many readers, ancient and modern, that structure is intoxicating. Named kings, named cities, a catastrophe that wipes the slate and a new beginning. It feels like a memory of a world before us, dimly recalled through ritual lists and temple recitations. It is easy to look at those enormous numbers and think, perhaps there really was a lost civilization long before 30,000 BCE, whose records we have not found. Perhaps these reigns are garbled echoes of that erased prehistory. A few modern authors push this much further. They take the king list at face value, treat the Antediluvian section as straightforward chronicle, and then ask, where are the ruins from 200,000 years ago? If we do not see them, they say, it must be because the evidence has been suppressed or destroyed or lies on the ocean floor. The actual situation is both less dramatic and, in a different way, more interesting. Archaeology across Mesopotamia shows dense settlement beginning in the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic, from about 6000 BCE onward, with earlier hunter-gatherer and village sites. Before that, we find gradual growth irrigation temples, surplus storage, then cities, stone tools, then copper, then bronze. There's no sign of an urban civilization in southern Iraq 100,000 or 200,000 years ago. The sediments, the stratigraphy, and the radiocarbon dates are quite clear on this cavity. At the same lack, floods were real. The Tigris and Euphrates do and did burst their banks. Individual sites, like Shuripak and Kish, show flood deposits in the early 3rd millennium BCE that could easily have been remembered as devastating the flood of living memory. Over generations, such events can grow in the retelling, expand backward in time, and merge with older Near Eastern motifs of cosmic deluge. In that sense, the king list may preserve a layered memory, a real tradition of city kingship going back a few centuries, names of places and rulers that we can sometimes corroborate, an echo of serious flooding that marked a break between eras for specific communities, and on top of that, an ideological framework that stretches those memories across a cosmic timeline and anchors them in a divine narrative about kingship descending from heaven, surviving catastrophe, and continuing through the present dynasty. The world before us in the king list is not a hidden technological civilization. It is an earlier way of organizing memory, a world where time is thick with meaning, where numbers say more about status and sanctity than about calendars, and where history begins not when people start writing, but when someone decides to line the past up, king by king, and inscribe it on clay. If kingship descends from heaven, somebody has to be up there to send it. In the Mesopotamian texts, that somebody is not a single-robed patriarch or a council of 12 space engineers. It is a whole population of powers. Among them are the Anunnaki. In the oldest Sumerian sources, Anuna or Anunnaki does not mean one specific god with a personality and a biography. It is a collective term, a category. Often, the Anunnaki are the great gods of the assembly, especially those tied to the underworld and to destiny. In some hymns, they sit in judgment. In some myths, they attend banquets. In others, they described as the 50 great gods, or as the divine council that decides fates, alongside An and Lilani. List of gods written on clay tablets from places like Farah, Nippur, and later Assur group the Anunnaki with other categories. The Igigi, the gods of heaven, the gods of earth. Different cities, different periods, different scribal schools distribute the labels slightly differently. There is no single canon where the Anunnaki are always the same numbered group, doing the same job, under the same leader. In other words, when we read Anunnaki in translation, we're not looking at a proper name, like Zeus. We are looking at something closer to the high court or the senior officials of the divine world. This matters when we move from straight accounts to myths. On one side of the cuneiform archive are the texts that built the first writing systems. Lists, tallies, receipts. They record rations, deliveries, work teams, field boundaries. Their language is stripped down and conventionalized. A line about 20 workers of the god and leal, or bread for the Anunnaki, is not trying to be poetic. It is following a formula. On the other side are compositions like Enki and the world order in Nana, as descent to the netherworld, and later the Akkadian Atrasis and Enuma Elish. Here the gods act, speak, plot, complain. Here the Anunnaki may be said to decree the fates, to sit at drink, to bind their hearts in council. These lines are dense with metaphor, illusion, and traditional stock phrases. A single Sumerian verb can mean decide, cut, fix, or engrave, depending on context. A word translated create in one line might mean assign a role in another. That ambiguity is not a translation failure. It is built into the poetry. The same writing system used for Bali accounts is being stretched to talk about the structure of reality. Modern ancient astronaut readings of the Anunnaki lean almost entirely on those mythic passages, but they often treat them as if they were administrative prose. Authors in that genre will point to lines where the gods fashion mankind from clay, give them the pickaxe and basket, or impose the yoke of labor, and say, "This is a literal account of genetic engineering by extraterrestrial overseers." They will cite that the Anunnaki came down from heaven, descended or went up as directional indicators of spacecraft rather than ritual language of rank and domain. They will note that some gods bear titles translated as overseer of irrigation, supervisor of canals, lord of the pickaxe, and treat these like job descriptions in a management chart for a planetary mining operation. Assyriologists, working tablet by tablet, disagree at almost every step of that chain. Where the popular books see technical vocabulary, Philologists see familiar Near Eastern metaphors. Clay is what humans, tablets, and bricks are all made of. Of course, it appears in origin stories. The pickaxe is a shorthand for human agricultural labor. The yoke is an image for obligation in many languages. Descending from heaven is an idiom for divine authority, long before rockets. And the same texts that supposedly describe a slave workforce engineered for gold extraction also linger on rituals, music, temple building, and the etiquette of divine feasts. Concerns that map cleanly onto Bronze Age city-states, not silicon refineries. None of this proves in the absolute sense that there were no visitors, no lost technologies, no forgotten ages of the world. It is always logically possible to imagine more layers than the ones we can see. But when we ask what the tablets themselves in their own script and grammatical texture are actually doing, the answer is theology, politics, cosmology, and literature, not technical reports. There is, however, quite a mystery that does not require conspiracies. From the beginning of writing, humans reach beyond themselves. A system invented to track grain and goats is very quickly used to write names of gods, offerings, hymns, kingless place rulers in a cosmic sequence. Myths populate the sky and the deep with councils of beings who decide fates, measure lifespan, send floods, confer kingship. Part of this is power. Saying the Anunnaki chose my dynasty is more persuasive than we won the last war. Part of it is psychology. When the oldest records you have are incomplete, half-erased tablets, lists that start in the middle, numbers that don't quite make sense, it is natural to imagine a larger pattern just out of reach. A time before the flood, a council above the sky. Are they who know? Our own stories about ancient astronauts are in that sense recognizably human. Faced with broken evidence and unexplained gaps, we too populate the unseen with intelligences that look a bit like ourselves, just scaled up and moved off-world. We rename the Anunnaki as engineers rather than elders, but the gesture is similar. The clay does not settle that question. It only shows that as far back as we can read, the urge to fill the silence above the text with a larger cosmic story was already there. If we want to know what the clay actually says, we have to talk about how people read clay now. Not the movie version with a lone genius staring at a tablet until it clicks, but the slow, methodical way Assyriologists and epigraphers work through a script. The basic toolkit is surprisingly down to earth. Start with sign lists. For any script from early Uruk proto-cuneiform to Linear A, scholars first try to catalogue every distinct mark that appears. Each shape gets a number, a conventional name, and examples of where it occurs. For Sumerian form, those lists are immense. Wedge clusters that began as pictures of heads, jars, stars, feet for proto-Elamite or the Indus signs. The lists are shorter, but also more uncertain. Are these two slightly different shapes really two signs, or just sloppy handwriting of one? Next comes paleography, the study of how those signs change over time and place. A tablet from Uruk, around 3200 BCE, doesn't write its signs exactly the same way as one from Ea, around 2100 BCE. Corners get rounded, wedges tilt, strokes are dropped. By lining up hundreds or thousands of tablets, specialists can say, this form of the sign is earlier, this streamlined version is later. That lets them date tablets, trace scribal traditions, and avoid assuming that a sign in 3000 BCE must mean what it clearly means in 1800 BCE. Often, it doesn't. Whenever we're lucky, there are bilingual or multilingual texts The famous Rosetta Stone did this for Egyptian hieroglyphs, the same decree in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. For cuneiform royal inscriptions of the first millennium BCE sometimes appear in multiple languages and scripts on the same monument. Akkadian, Elamite, Old Persian. Even earlier, Sumerian and Akkadian share tablets with glosses, translations, and word lists. These are gold. They allow scholars to match unknown signs to known words, to confirm phonetic values, and to see how scribes themselves understood their own systems. Names, onomastics, are another anchor. Personal names, place names, divine names. In a partially understood script, you look for recurring clusters that plausibly spell familiar names mentioned elsewhere. If a certain sequence appears only in a context that looks like a list of merchants, and the pattern fits a known Semitic or Elamite name structure, that's a clue. That is how parts of Linear B and many cuneiform languages were nailed down by hunting for Knossos, Amaduka, Inanna, Shurapak. And beneath all of this is statistical patterning. How often does a sign occur? What can it stand next to? Do some signs only appear at the beginning of a line like headings? Do some clusters repeat at regular intervals, like grammatical endings or case markers? With the Indus script, for instance, statistical studies strongly suggest a structured system. Certain signs prefer initial positions, others final ones that looks like a logo, syllabic, or morphemic script, not random symbols. But the texts are too short and the language unknown, so the statistics give structure without yielding a full key. Even when we read a script, that word hides two different achievements. One level is phonetic reading, being able to look at a sign and say, this has the value due in Sumerian or add in Akkadian to spell out words letter by letter or sign by sign. For many early Mesopotamian tablets, we can do this. We know the syllary, the standard logs, the determinatives that mark gods, professions, cities. The deeper level is understanding, knowing the grammar, the idioms, the semantic fields. A Sumerian verb may have a dozen possible meanings. Case endings stack. Prefixes telescope entire prepositional phrases into a few consonants at the front of a word. When modern translations differ, it is often not because we cannot read the signs, but because we are arguing over whether a line says, the gods fix the fates, or the gods engrave the measurements, or the gods assigned the offices. For scripts like proto-Elamite, we are not even securely at the first level. Researchers can spot numerals, commodity markers, some account structures, but they cannot consistently assign sounds or full words. The tablets look like economic documents, but the exact contents remain foggy. With the Indus Linear A, we hover in between. Some sign values have been proposed by reasonable analogy. Others remain anonymous shapes. In the last few decades, the tools have changed again. Multispectral imaging let scholars read tablets and inscriptions that were considered illegible. Different wavelengths of light bring out faint wedge impressions, erased lines, or ink traces under later scribbles. A tablet that looked blank under a desk lamp suddenly shows a ghost of signs in infrared. 3D scanning captures the exact shape of each wedge and crack. Cuneiform is three-dimensional. The depth and angle of the stylus can matter. High-resolution meshes allow specialists to rotate a tablet virtually, check damaged edges, and distinguish a shallow accidental scratch from a real stroke of a sign. Entire archives like those from Uruk or Nippur are being scanned this way and made available and online. And then there are open digital corpora. Projects like CDLI, OACC, and others put transliterations, translations, photos, and metadata for tens of thousands of texts onto the web. Instead of one scholar slowly paging through clay in a museum basement, many people can query the same database, search for every occurrence of a rare sign sequence, or run new statistical models across an entire genre. Machine learning is being brought in carefully to cluster sign variants, propose restorations, or flag unusual patterns humans might miss. All of this has sped up the work, but it has not made it fast. Decipherment progresses one small, argued-over step at a time. A newly read sign here, a narrowed-down meaning there, the redating of a tablet that shifts a whole paleographic sequence by a century. Proto-Elamite has resisted for over a century. The Indus signs have been studied for almost as long without consensus. Linear A has sat beside fully deciphered Linear B for more than 50 years, and still only yields fragments of certainty. Some of these scripts may remain in that lineal state for a long time, partially described, statistically modeled, but not fully read in the way Egyptian or Sumerian now are. The bottlenecks are real. Short texts, no bilingual, unknown languages, limited contexts. Yet progress is real. The oldest Uruk tablets, that once seemed like pure picture lists, are now recognized as sophisticated accounting systems with standardized notations. New readings of Sumerian grammar continue to revise translations of myths and god lists. And every improved photograph, every new sign index, tightens the frame. In the middle of this slow work, if you'd like something quieter to fall asleep to, our book of long-form evidence-based bedtime history is now available at sleepytimehistory.com. And there's a discount this week. What all of this means is that when we look at a broken clay tablet and say, we don't yet know what this line means, that is not a confession of defeat. It is a snapshot of a process, a record of where we are in a conversation with the past that is still ongoing. And if one of these undeciphered scripts finally does yield, if a bilingual turns up in a forgotten storeroom, or a new computational approach cracks a pattern we hadn't seen, that conversation could change in an instant. When that change comes, it probably won't look like a Hollywood reveal. It might look like a footnote in a specialist journal. We propose revising the phonetic value of sign 347 from gay to sha in early proto-Elamite contexts. Quiet, technical, easy to skip. But if that sign appears on hundreds of tablets, if it sits in the middle of numerical strings and commodity notations, that one change can cascade. Grain deliveries become wool rations. Temple of so-and-so becomes storehouse at such-and-such. A city that seemed to be importing food turns out to be exporting it. The direction of a trade network flips. This is how big discoveries usually arrive in the world of ancient writing, not as a single key that unlocks everything at once, but as a slow turning of gears where one small tooth finally catches. Imagine, for instance, that a cluster of proto-Elamite signs on tablets from Susa, long assumed to be generic account headings, are convincingly read as place names. Suddenly, those early 3rd millennium ledgers are no longer just 5 measures, 10 measures, 3 workers. They map routes. We might trace caravans from the Susiana plain into the Zagros, or down toward the Persian Gulf. We might see that what looked like a local bookkeeping system was embedded in a wider sphere of exchange that included Uruk and Susa, maybe even distant Meluha. Or suppose a new sign value in Linear A turns a list of goods into a list of people with titles. What used to be anonymous numbers on a tablet from Phaistos or Zakros become ranks in a hierarchy. Overseers, scribes, cult personnel. A palace that seemed modest could reveal itself as the center of a dense administrative web. The political structure of Bronze Age Crete would sharpen from vague palatial society to something with offices and chains of command. Even in Sumerian, where we can read a lot, the oldest tablets are still opaque in crucial ways. A clearer understanding of one recurring term in the earliest Uruk accounts might reveal whether the central institution was more like a temple, a household, a proto-state office, or something we don't have a modern category for. That affects how we think writing begins as a tool of cult, of economy, of kingship, or of something in between. New readings could also reach into daily life. An Indus inscription on a seal, if ever securely linked to a longer text, or a bilingual, might turn unidentified symbol sequence into cattle overseer, weaver's quarter, or a personal name. If several such readings line up, the little amulets and sealings from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro stop being mute logos and start naming occupations, neighborhoods, perhaps even clans. We would move from statistical patterns of signs to glimpses of bakers, metal workers, boatmen. Religious ideas sit in the balance too. Early god lists on badly damaged Sumerian tablets could be clarified by a new understanding of just a few divine names or epithets. That in turn would refine how we read later myths that look back to a time before the flood, before kingship came down from heaven. When those lists mention rulers who reigned for impossibly long spans, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, the Samrian scribes are probably not doing geology. They're doing ideology. But better readings can show exactly how. Before us in these texts may mean several different things at once. Sometimes it clearly means mythic time, an era of semi-divine kings and culture heroes where numbers are symbolic and geography is blurred. Sometimes it is ideological time, a constructed golden age used to legitimize present institutions. We rule now because our line goes back to the antediluvian kings, and sometimes before points to a real dimly remembered historical horizon. Earlier dynasties, earlier cities, earlier floods and relocations that the clay only partly records. Future translations won't suddenly prove that an advanced unknown civilization built everything and vanished, but they could show that the early third millennium world was more interconnected, more mobile, more experimental than we thought. Trade networks reaching farther, seasonal migrations baked into the records, religious practices spreading along with copper and lapis, then taking on local flavors as they arrive in new river valleys. Somewhere in a storeroom, there may already be a tablet that holds one of these quiet revolutions. Maybe it is a small proto-Elamite account, with an overlooked column of signs that turn out to be month names anchoring the whole system to a specific calendar. Maybe it is a broken Linear A tablet, whose missing corner, if found, would repeat a phrase also preserved in Linear B, finally giving us a bilingual line. Maybe it is a mundane Sumerian school exercise that glosses an archaic sign with a later, clearer word, bridging a gap in meaning we've been guessing at for a century. We do not know yet which piece of clay will shift the story, or whether it has already been excavated and simply waits for a new imaging technique, a fresh pair of eyes, or a different question. But the potential is there quietly in every unread line. If you pull back now from the details and just listen to what all this clay has been saying, the first thing it tells us is how ordinary the beginning really is. The oldest secure writing we have is not a lost gospel from a vanished super-civilization. It is wedges in damp river mud, recording barley, sheep, beer, Labor Days. It appears in cities we can locate on a map, Uruk Nasa Susa, between roughly 3400 and 300 BCE. It grows out of earlier traditions of clay tokens, bully and seal impressions. We can see the administrative logic tightening as pictures turn into stylized signs, as round impressions turn into rule tablets. And yet even here in a genre we think we understand, there is a lot we still can't read. Thousands of Uruk and Jemdet Nasa tablets sit in museums with catalogue numbers and basic descriptions, account tablet, list of commodities, but line after line of signs whose exact values and grammar are debated. Proto-Elamite texts from Susa and Tali Malian stare back at us with symbol inventories we can classify and count, but not translate. Seals and tablets from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro show consistent patterns that look like a true script, but with inscriptions so short and so isolated that no one can follow them into a sentence. Linear A tablets from Crete and the Aegean are clearly doing accounting, probably ritual, maybe administration, but the language behind the signs remains unnamed. So we occupy an odd position. On one hand, the broad outlines are solid. Writing, as far as current evidence shows, begins in the late 4th millennium BCE, independently in Mesopotamia and Egypt, perhaps slightly later in the Indus and on Crete. Its earliest sustained use is administrative, ration lists, tax receipts, inventories, allocations tied to institutions that mix religion, economy, and politics. The grand myths and king lists come later. Once the system is already well established as a tool of power and memory, on the other hand, the fine grain is still full of uncertainty. We can be fairly confident that a given column is counting jars of oil, but we may not know exactly what the heading at the top calls the place, or how the people in the list are categorized. We can identify an Indus sign that nearly always appears at the end of a sequence, but we do not know if it's a title, a grammatical marker, a clan emblem, a verb. We can match linear A signs to their linear B descendants phonetically, and yet the underlying words stay opaque because the language is different. To listen to the clay responsibly is to hold both of these truths at once. The tablets are real, datable, excavated in stratified contexts. Their basic administrative function is not mysterious, and at the same time, large portions of what they actually say, names, place designations, find distinctions between offices and offerings. The shades of meaning in early divine titles remain out of reach. That leaves a wide space for possibility, but not for anything goes. When later texts speak of ages before the flood, or kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, they're working within traditions we can partially trace. Priestly lineages, ritual calendars, landscapes reshaped by real floods and dynastic turnovers. It is tempting to plug those gaps with neat answers, lost continents, wiped clean technologies. But the clay does not demand that. It invites slower questions instead. What did these people think counted as before? How did they use memory, exaggeration, and myth to make their present make sense? Wonder, not certainty, is the right response. The oldest writing on Earth shows us a world both distant and familiar. Temples doubling as warehouses, officials counting grain on tablets instead of in spreadsheets, communities tying their lives to cycles of water and trade. It also shows us the limits of what we can know from broken artifacts and partial scripts. The fact that so much remains unread is not a failure. It is an honest boundary, and also a promise that new work still matters. If you'd like to keep following these quiet, difficult stories of scripts half heard and worlds half recovered, it helps a lot if you let the algorithm know. If this kept you company tonight, Tap like, subscribe to the channel, and maybe leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love seeing the modern map that gathers around these very ancient places. Thank you for listening. If you would like to join me for more stories, I would be grateful if you would subscribe. Take care of yourself.